Hello, and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today I'm honored to have Jared Mosley with me. Jared is the VP and Director of Athletics at the University of North Texas, and one of the things I think you're going to hear about today is when you find a passion of yours and you pursue it, it can turn into a career. So, Jared, thanks so much for being on today.
No, happy to be on. Appreciate it, Phil.
Yeah. Well, to start your story, you grew up in Texas and fell in love with sports, early in life. So talk a little bit about growing up, getting into competitive athletics at a young age.
Yeah, I grew up in a really small town in West Texas. Had little bit over 2,000 people in my hometown, so not a big place. And grew up in a time where my dad was a farmer, my mom was involved in education, and so really the career paths in a small town like that, you start to dream. I knew I didn't want to be a farmer. Just putting my hopes and dreams in the hands of Mother Nature. But always had a passion for sports, and certainly growing up was, played baseball and football and basketball. But when you're in a little bitty uh, rural town of 2,000 and you grow to be 6 foot 7 inches, basketball tends to take over and you lean into that. And so as I got into high school, really started to focus on the opportunity to try to develop and earn a scholarship to play basketball, and was fortunate to get that opportunity at Abilene Christian University.
Yeah. So before we get to Abilene Christian, I always think, our parents, they're an example, and they're one of the first examples we see. They're the first teacher mentor. And growing up in a agriculture family, being in Nebraska, I understand that. I didn't have parents that were in farming, but understand the work ethic and some of the jobs that children are asked to do. But talk a little bit about the work ethic side of things for you and what you learned, growing up around the farming operation.
No, my dad was always, he had us around. I can remember as a really small child in the summers, we'd go out and, he's changing irrigation pipe, and, we're out there trying to weed the fields and do all the things that are required on a farm. And, when you have equipment breakdown, you don't get to always just wait for somebody else. You learn how to, you know, fix things and tap into ingenuity when you need to. And so I can remember early, my dad would get us up. It would be, sun wouldn't be out yet, and we'd be up and in the truck with him going to sit on a tractor for the day. And it's one of the things I actually miss my kids having that opportunity, because I do think, I can remember being about 7, 8 years old and my dad letting me drive the pickup for the first time. So
Yeah.
he's unloading pipe from the trailer, and all you're doing is just like scooting down so he can be efficient in what he does. But, the responsibilities you kind of learn in that environment, and the things you just don't realize in the moment that you take in watching your dad, work and put in, a lot of work just for the hopes that you can get a good crop and a good yield like that. All those things stuck with me growing up. And I think a little bit, just looking at the things that have really shaped kind of who I am, discipline's a big thing for me. And I think, anytime that, you grow up and you watch, you have an example in front of you of somebody who gets up early, who puts in the work, who, the work's not done until you get to the finish line and the job's done. Like, you can't just quit in farming if you're tired or things don't quite go right. Like, you constantly have to put the time and energy into it. And so my dad certainly modeled that for me growing up.
I love it. Now, to your point, you become great at basketball, and so you decide to go to Abilene Christian University. And over the time there, you amass the record of the 11th leading or the 11th highest scorer, the 8th highest rebounder. Talk a little about the progression. I think, that college athletics, you can be great in high school, but now all of a sudden you're playing against guys that might be 4, 5, 6 years older than you. And, there's a big difference between 18-year-old you and 24-year-old male. So talk a little bit about, freshman year and the progression through your career.
Before you do that, I may tap just real quick into the how I got to ACU, because I think
Yeah.
when you talk about moments in your life that really define opportunities. So my dad did not graduate from college. He did do a couple of semesters at Abilene Christian University, and I remember growing up, I did not. I was getting recruited by a lot of low to mid major Division I schools. I did not have Abilene Christian on my radar, and so my dad, uh, being a farmer, we could never take like long vacations away from home. So we would go to Dallas every summer and catch Texas Rangers games and watch 3 or 4 games, and then head back home. But I remember my dad one time saying, "Hey, I want to drive you by where I went to school," and I just kind of rolled my eyes. I thought, we'll go see it. Well, when we got there, he had ulterior motive. He said, "Hey, let's go see if the basketball coaches are in."
Mm.
And so we did. Walked up. They happened to be in that day, and from that moment on, ACU was at every event I had that summer and started the process of recruiting me. And so you think about moments. I would not be at Abilene Christian had my dad not had just wanted to go show us where he went to school. But you talk about development. I laugh about this because, like, in high school, everybody thinks they're great and they see a path to success and they think it's going to be an easy road. And I can remember, I started my college career. I was 6'7". I didn't even weigh 200 pounds. I think I was 199 pounds. And so you go into that first year and you're playing against grown men. I mean, my freshman year was an all conference player. He was 6'7", 260. And like, I just remember that the physicality, coming in was an eye opener. And to be honest, I think that first year, I mean, I didn't play as much as I thought I should. Looking back, I know I wasn't ready. But you just go through the frustrations of coming off of being, one of the best players wherever you came from to then joining a group where that's everybody in the locker room. And, you really have to dig in and figure out, why am I doing this? Like, it becomes, at the college level, basketball is a little bit of a business. Like, you have to treat it like you need to have fun and you need to find the passion in it. But at the end of the day, I learned pretty early, like, I'm going to have to really dig in if I'm going to create separation and give myself an opportunity to ever play. And, so you ride that roller coaster your freshman year. My sophomore year was slightly better. I started to get some minutes. I think by my sophomore year, I was up to about 215, 20 pounds. Then my junior year is really where it switched for me. I had a coach, an assistant coach, who really simplified the post game for me.
Mm.
I wasn't the biggest post player, but I could shoot. I had quickness, and so he really simplified to where I wasn't having to think about the game a lot. I could become reactive just based on feel, and he certainly encouraged me to a place where the confidence in between my ears matched, the things I was working on with my
Mm.
game. And so found myself my junior year. I came off the bench. I mean, we had a loaded team. And I was a first team all conference player, but I was the sixth man. I didn't start that year. Um, and I think that was a lesson for me too. And certainly as I've moved beyond my basketball playing days, I just remind young student athletes and even young staff that we have, like, everybody's role is important. And we can in our head think the most important thing is, am I starting or am I not in that position? But people coming off the bench are equally important, and the skills that somebody has in the moment they get to be on the floor is important. And so, to have that happen my junior year, I think really set a foundation for me even now on how I can mentor and encourage student athletes who maybe the first year or two aren't exactly what they think, but if you accept the opportunity and the role and you keep working hard, the path tends to find itself for you.
Now, I want to dive into that because I think that's super profound. And, someone listening right now says, gosh, I feel like I got passed up for the promotion, or I feel like I don't have the title that I deserve, in my work life. And to your point, you might have felt, and, knowing you were first team all conference, you might have deserved to be starting, right? But for whatever reason, the way the chemistry worked, it wasn't the right timing, coach's decision, things outside of your control didn't prohibit you from excelling in the role when you had the opportunity. And so, talk a bit about that from a professional standpoint. Someone listening right now that says, "Gosh, I feel like I should have this title," but the difference between maybe leading with title and leading with your impact and how you've done that.
No, I think that's and it's one of the things my another lesson my dad taught me early. I can remember in high school I was a freshman on the varsity, and I actually did start. And but before I got to the position of being able to start, I remember my dad saying, you got to approach the game of basketball like you control the things you can, and give your coach no choice but to have to play you or start you.
Yeah.
And those words just stuck with me. And I do think professionally, it's tough. Like in the world of college athletics, I look particularly now, like it's a tough era to try to climb and progress in the profession because, you're seeing opportunities are limited. Everybody wants to be in sports. And so anytime we post a job or, the amount of interest we get significant. And, I just remind people, focus on the things that you bring that provide value back. And as long as you do what you do well and you do it in your gifting, like you tend to find a way. Sometimes, and I've had conversations with staff here too, that structure is a big thing in corporate and certainly within athletics. And so sometimes not getting a promotion or not being elevated has nothing to do with the quality of work you have. It may just be there's somebody ahead of you, and it's until that opens, you don't get that opportunity. And so I've shared with people there are times in your career where you do have to say maybe I need to go away and get a different perspective or a different experience, and then ultimately can come back if it's at the same institution or in a similar role to continue to chase the dream. And I think that for me, really kind of the first time I stepped out in my own professional career was after spending 14 years in college athletics, 10 as an athletic director at Abilene Christian University. I had an opportunity to step completely outside of athletics to jump into a role at the Texas Sports Hall of Fame. And you look at those moments, like I felt like in my career I could have stayed probably at Abilene Christian, but I just felt like there was something else that could open up maybe some further growth for me, but also opportunity down the road. And so it's for people who are sometimes struggling, you know, you feel like you may have to leave, but just the anxiousness and the nervousness about jumping into something like that, like, sometimes you just got to follow your gut and your heart on those things. And again, I think as long as you continue to focus on, how am I improving every day? How can I make sure I bring my very best to whatever my job is and bring value to whatever organization I have? You tend to see it may not be always in your timing, but those people who can stay focused and driven tend to find pathways to navigate upward mobility in their career.
I love it. That's great. Now, for you in your senior year, once again, now you're the big dog, right? And the role changes. You're the person that, not that you weren't before, but certainly everyone's looking to you as being the leader. So, talk a bit about stepping into that senior year and kind of the not necessarily a changing of a role, but a different perspective of a role for you as being, not only arguably the best player on the team, but also, the senior class now.
No, I mean, I think it's one of those things in life is sometimes difficult to navigate is how to step into leadership. It's one thing to be looked to and people lean into you, but when you officially move into whether it's being a senior or if it's a new title and a promotion that comes with additional responsibility, like I do remember the weight of that. I do remember being a captain and one of the things that still drives me today is I never wanted to be put in that position and not lead in everything, whether that's getting to practice early, the amount of time I put in, early morning runs. I didn't want to just meet the time. I wanted to give my very best and push. And a part of that's in my DNA, and I think it's one of those things. Again, looking back, just watching my mom and dad and the example they set as far as how to whatever the task at hand, always give your best. Like, I think when you step into those opportunities, certainly as a senior, you start to realize the little things you do matter when you're going to try to get in a heat of the moment situation. And maybe you have to, and I certainly had teammates call me out, but if you have to like step up and encourage somebody to get back on the path or get back in the boat, you got to make sure you've taken care of business. Like, you don't want to be a hypocrite asking them to do things you haven't done yourself. And so, those things are not always, until you get in those moments, you really don't know how to respond or how you'll do it. But I did lean a lot into, again, some of the advice and examples I saw in my parents growing up.
I love it. Now, not only did you excel on the basketball court, but you also excelled academically. And so after your time playing at Abilene Christian came to an end, you ended up getting a job with them, which my guess is, they don't just offer those to every athlete. There's probably certain things that they're looking for or characteristics that you had throughout your time there that made you a no-brainer of a candidate. So talk a little bit about, stepping in and working there, and maybe even kind of like you just mentioned on the, leadership side of basketball, now almost that new perspective of like, I was just a student here, I was just an athlete here, but now I need to be viewed as the professional, and talk about that for you.
So I went back to Abilene Christian after playing overseas a little bit. Went back as a graduate assistant on the basketball side of things, and I always thought I was going to coach in my career for a lengthy period of time, and then maybe slide into administration later. But I'll rewind. When I moved back before officially started my GA-ship, I came on as I had to do my student teaching to finish my degree at Abilene Christian. And so I was a student assistant for the assistant athletic director for internal operations. And so I had a relationship with that gentleman while I was a student athlete there. And so when I came in, he allowed me and he handed off to me all outside events. So any event that was a rental, somebody wanting to use our facilities, and we had 3 or 4 pretty significant ones. I worked through those. So whether it was hosting regional tournaments for the state of Texas, or we had a couple of different basketball groups who would rent the facility over spring break, he gave me those and said, hey, you have to staff them. You have to set up and know what they need. You have to, get people paid, you know, and so it was my first really dip into just the many facets of what, as a student athlete, you show up, the gym's open, the lights are on, you go practice, you go home, you don't realize the work that goes into successfully just day-to-day operations, but certainly, events. And so I was able to dip my toe into that. And so fast forward, when I was a GA, was in my first year as a GA. The gentleman that I worked under as assistant AD, he moved to another institution, and so that job came open. And at the time, I thought, well, I want to interview for the job, put my name in the hat. I had zero expectation to get the job. I just thought I'm good. They'll give me an interview because they know me. It'll be good practice and be good preparation. Well, I go through the interview process, and they ultimately end up offering me the job as assistant AD for, internal operations. And so you step into that role, your eyes, they're wide open. You realize there's a whole lot you don't know. And fortunately, I had some great mentors and people around me who really poured into me in my time at ACU. The blessing and curse of going to work at your alma mater is people know you, but also people know you. And so,
Yeah.
the great thing was I had a ton of relationships across campus with faculty who had me in class that had developed into great friendships. And so, I had a safety net in a lot of ways in my first opportunity in college athletics to have a lot of support and people who wanted to see me succeed. And so, it was great to be able to jump into that, and it wasn't I wasn't having to learn everything because I was very familiar with campus, but I was able to tap into a lot of great relationships there, in that moment. And I think you look at too. I share with people some of my career path. From that moment on, so over the next 3 years, we had 3 other staff members leave that ACU said, well, we're not in a position to hire them, so will you do external. So I overtook corporate sponsorships, game day, and events, in addition to my internal opportunities. And then a year later, our compliance officer left, and they said, "Hey, will you do compliance?" And so, literally, it's God's favor and oversight that I didn't just run the thing into the ground. Like I had no clue what I was doing in one of those areas, much less have an oversight of all. But I do think, in my journey to ultimately become an athletic director, having the chance to kind of have experience in each of those areas definitely gave me perspective in one where the difficulties are, with people who are in those roles. So even today, I know there are certain jobs that are they're all hard, but some of them are uniquely tough, and so it gives you a little bit of a lens to lean into and make sure people are doing well, and seeing how you can inject yourself as a leader to help provide encouragement and support. And so, all that, there was a lot of a learning curve and growth opportunities, but sometimes I think just being thrown in the fire is not a bad thing. You get a chance to really test the things that you think could work or should work. It forces you to lean into mentors and people who have walked the path ahead of you. And so, while I wouldn't recommend that path for everybody, it certainly, if you find yourself there, I think there's a lot to learn being just thrown into the fire like that.
I love it. Now, kind of two things to what you were talking about. One is something I've always been a firm believer is, you're constantly interviewing for the next opportunity, right? And how you carry yourself, how you treat people, because you just never know who's got the connection, and all of a sudden, hey, if Jared hadn't been a good student, probably faculty didn't like him, right? If you had been rude to your teammates, probably a good chance your coach doesn't want you to come back as a GA, right? So there's certain, character qualities that as you're living it, inevitably that's either opening or closing doors for future use. So I'd love you to talk on that. And then number two, just within, you know, having those opportunities, being willing to say yes to something, even though you might be sitting there saying, I don't know how the heck to do that, but sometimes it just takes the yes, right? So just talk about those two items.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly interesting when you go through. I think anytime you have a job, it's easy to get in the rut of, maybe you're not satisfied in exactly what you're doing, or you want to be so bad an athletic director that your mind kind of takes over and it really becomes more of a barrier to those opportunities. And so, it kind of gets back to, you mentioned it earlier, worry about the things that you can control.
Yeah.
And, I think too, occasionally pausing and really thinking through, okay, what do I want to ultimately do in my life and career and vocation, and then roadmap what you think it might take to get there, and what are the skills you need to develop, who are the people you need to lean into. And I can recall, thinking about somebody who really helped shape the way I navigated my career. I had a strong mentor, a gentleman named Robin Blakely, who I met and became really good friends with, and still call him a great friend today. He's been a huge influence in my life. And I remember when I was at ACU, well before I left Abilene Christian, he introduced me to a friend of his, Bob Bodine, who's an executive, he does a lot of executive searches, and he's in that industry, super successful, a lot of stuff with corporate side of things, but heavy into pro sports and college sports and searches, and developed a friendship with him. And I can remember two things. I remember talking to him, and he wrote a book called The Power of Who. And this book really has kind of shaped. At that point, I was in my late 20s when I had met him, and it really shaped my perspective on networking. I think in today's society, and certainly with Facebook and the things we kind of find ourselves in the middle of, it's a lot of affirmation. It's very superficial. It's we think, can I just get to know as many people or have as many followers as possible, instead of really thinking through who are the people in my corner who can ultimately set me up for success. And
Yeah.
he recalled an experience he had in this book that he went back over his book of business and realized, just looking through everything, that it really came down to a handful of people who continued to open doors for him because they cared for him as a person and wanted to see him succeed. And in the example, he gives, he shares a little bit about, whether you're a believer or not. I mean, you can't deny the impact that, uh, you know, that religion and faith and those who believe in Jesus Christ, like that's a movement that's going strong 2,000 plus years later. And he said, think about it. It started with a guy who had 12 close friends, three of which were close to him, one of which he loved. And he said, if you model your relationships in that manner and really think about the 10 to 12 people that you can go
Mm.
deep with, who then will then open up any door you want. And he always would tell me, he said, listen, whatever job you want to do down the road, God's already put a connection in front of you. You just got to figure out what the connection is. And so
Wow.
I share with our folks all the time. I think I've been fortunate in that I'm not, and my wife and I talk about this often. I don't have a huge circle. I have a lot of people I know and acquaintances because of the role I'm in, but I have a pretty tight inner circle. And I can tell you every major career decision and even certain life decisions that I've had, I can go back to one of those dozen people who either I made the phone call or they made a connection or and I think that's one of the most important things I've learned in my career journey is, so many of those things, like take advantage, not selfishly for what you can gain out of it, but the people who, if anybody called me who's in that tight circle, I'm going to want to do anything I can in their time of need to help them. And
Yep.
that's the best upward mobility and movement in life. And I think if people really evaluate just the relationships they have and how to really lean into the people that are closest to you, you can figure out a path to navigate. And certainly in athletics, I tell people, young aspiring administrators in this, when you go to conferences or you go to conventions, or if you're in a town where you've got a chance to go maybe pick up a phone and have coffee with somebody, don't just try to meet everybody for the sake of meeting everybody, but dig into some people you respect, you appreciate their approach to how they lead. And so build intentional mentors and relationships that down the road you can, when you're needing to pick up the phone and figure out, how can I get involved in this, or how can I handle this situation? You've got a great net there behind you to catch you and assist you.
That's so good. I love it. So, talking about that and opening doors and connections, you mentioned it earlier, but as you know, things are going well at Abilene Christian, but a different opportunity to be CEO and president of the Texas Sports Hall of Fame presents itself to you. And talk a little bit about how that came to be, and then ultimately, the decision to take that job, right? I mean, after having been with Abilene Christian, I think it was like 14 or 15 years at that point, a lot of people would say, oh, well, Jared's a lifer, right? Like he's in a role, he's doing well, they're excelling. I mean, the sports programs were doing really well. There was no evident reason on why someone should leave, but there was some nudge or pull to take the step.
Yeah, I had, and it's funny because we're going to connect the dots here on the point I just made. So probably 3 or 4 years before I left ACU, I had breakfast with Bob Bodine in Dallas, and I just shared with Bob. I said, Bob, I'm not, I don't feel I need to leave today, but I do feel like everybody's got a runway of leadership where, at some point, just a new voice, new perspective is going to be needed to really take the next jump.
Mm,
And it's
yeah.
no um, knock on me personally or the thing. I just knew we were in the middle of making a decision to move to Division 1. And so we went, and that was a pretty lengthy, arduous process. And so we got to the end of that. And once we started, I realized my familiarity with ACU, and because I had been there, we had been Division 2. There wasn't a perspective from anybody who'd been outside of that umbrella and in the Division 1 world. I knew I probably, for the betterment of ACU, was going to need to step away. And so Bob comes to me and he says, and this was in 2014. He said, "Hey, I just got the search at the Texas Sports Hall of Fame." He said, "I think what they're looking for, you fit perfectly. And would you be interested in at least having a conversation with them?" And So I remember going to interview and got to interview with two amazing gentlemen who were on the board there. Carol Dawson, who was former general manager of the Houston Rockets, and Max Williams, who was a outstanding basketball player at SMU. Was got the Dallas Chaparrals started, which later became the San Antonio Spurs. And those two men, I remember sitting with them, and Bob said, he said, you're going to be able to stay involved in athletics, which is important to you. It's a role that really they need financial support, so you're going to be raising money and soliciting interest and trying to grow it. And I was like, but I don't have any experience with museums. He was like, hey, there's people there who can do that. Like, but what they really need is we need to expand the vision and the level of impact that Texas Sports Hall of Fame can have. And so I was really intrigued by that opportunity, and so ended up taking it and had a phenomenal run there and loved that job. And to be honest, I told my wife when I got out of college athletics, I said, I don't see myself jumping back in unless Ren Baker, and Ren's a good friend of mine who I'd met. He was a young AD. I was 27, he was 26. We were both college athletic directors. Neither one of us, we had a mutual friend who introduced us. And so in my 14 years at ACU, he was my last 10 there. He was kind of my closest friend and confidant in the business. And so I remember when I left and got to the Texas Sports Hall of Fame, I told my wife, I said, the only way I probably jump back in is if Ren gets a job and asks me to come work for him. And so you fast forward 2 years to 2016.
Yeah.
He gets the job here at North Texas. He reaches out and asks me if I'll come be his chief operating officer. I told him no once. He came back with he jokes, more money. And so we ultimately come to North Texas and spent 6.5 years here, or 6 years here with him. And then he gets the opportunity at West Virginia. And then I'm in a position here to get the opportunity to be the vice president director of athletics here. And so, again, I think I can point back to every major career decision or opportunity I've had, and it's pointed back to a very specific relationship to somebody who ultimately teed it up and gave me an opportunity for success. And so, it's one of those, I think you can always pass that up as maybe that was just chance, but I don't believe, I believe there's intentionality in those things. And so super grateful for, again, those close relationships that I've been able to develop who have helped me continue to move forward in my career.
Now, as you've, coached, mentored, developed, different people professionally, a wise word that was shared with me was, don't run from something, be excited and run to something, right? And I'm sure you've had many conversations with people who, I just don't think this is the right university for me. I think if I go to this one, then it is the better opportunity. And you can see, well, there's probably something that you need to develop and work on. And you're not wrong, like there might be another opportunity, but there might be some internal work. It's not always just hopping from school to school or job to job that's going to change it for you. If you're unsatisfied here because of X, Y, and Z, that may be something you need to work on because the next school you might have that same unsatisfaction. So talk a little bit about that, in just mentoring people as they've, evaluated making some of those big decisions to potentially change or look at a different opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's everyone's unique. But I do think there's an element, and I go back to my first year at Abilene Christian. Like, I remember walking in and having the conversation, like I was planning to transfer from ACU and leave because that first year did not go the way I wanted. I was not happy. And it's amazing if you can just weather through some of those experiences, whether that's, and it certainly applies on the professional side. Like, I've had multiple people who have said, year one or year two in a very specific position weren't great or fun. But had I not stayed, I wouldn't have earned this promotion, which now I'm in a position that I've flourished and I actually love and I'm excited about every day. Like, I think patience in our world today is not something that is easy. And I think it's probably, to be honest, what I worry the most about in what we do in college athletics is I don't feel our system sets young men and women up because the ability to just easily transfer when things aren't going the way you want them to, the ability to stick with something and have to endure a little bit of heartache and frustration and what that builds in you to then to take on the next challenge down the road. Like I don't think you can shortcut those things or just learn those in a moment. I think you have to go through some really tough life stuff in order to expand, the things you can handle down the road. And so I certainly encourage people, if you're working for somebody who's a jerk and the culture's toxic and those things, that's a different animal, and you do need to run from those. But I think if you're in a place where you like the people, but maybe you're just frustrated in the role and the job, sometimes being able to just weather it, lean into people who can help you get through it, you come out on the other end in a much better place.
I love that. Now, for you, as you mentioned earlier, hey, growing up and learning, lessons on the farm, that's one thing that my kids aren't learning. Something I'm always curious about is, how do you help instill, good work ethic in your children? Are there any certain things that you've done over time to just help them, learn value of hard work or, value of money, things like that?
No, I mean, I think it's tough because as a parent, you always want to prepare, you know, give your kids a better life than you had, or to avoid some of the challenges you had. But sometimes, those difficulties, like, the best thing you can do as a parent is to let kids hit a bump or two in the road and have to figure things out. And to also realize, like, your choices, decisions have consequences. And so I've always tried to be, with at least with my own kids, and it's great now. They're all at a stage, high school. I have one that's done with college, and he's working now. Just to know that we create safe spaces for conversations. If they are going through a hard time, to not tell them what to do, but to just be there to listen and help them process how they should move forward. To be there to encourage them. And I also think too, for me, I try to model. I'm up early every morning. I don't miss a workout. I get up at between 5:30 every day. Start my day working out, and like I build in a pretty structured routine. One, because it's the way I need to have things ordered to operate well, but I do think people discipline and structure, regardless of what it looks like for you, are important. And so I always tell my kids, I think control the things you can control. Always give your best every day. Treat people well and understand, like, you don't like your situation, like, you got a choice. Go figure out your path through your relationships or connections to make something better. I think all those little things, you get moments, when your kids are growing up, to not only tell them that, but then to walk with them when they start to try to figure out some of these things on their own. And so I don't know that I've always done it great, and I've certainly done plenty of things to probably traumatize my kids in my parenting. But the beauty of it is we're all resilient. We make it through it, and hopefully they can appreciate some of those lessons as they get a little bit older.
I love that. And last thing, that I'll kind of ask you about is, as a leader in your role today, right, and being at the Division One space, some would say, hey, this is kind of the pinnacle of, a role in your field. One thing that I think is really amazing about your journey is that you have sat in so many different roles at this point that I'm sure that, garners a great level of respect for you, but then also allows you to, have great empathy and sympathy with someone because, to your point earlier, I know that this job is actually harder than anyone else thinks, but I only know that because I did that job for 5 years or however long it is. So talk a little bit about that for you as a leader today, leading people and, helping them, just having that perspective of, I've sat in that shoe, I've worn that role before.
No, at the end of the day, I have a passion for college athletics. I have a passion for sports. But at the core of who I am, if I don't believe in something that's bigger connected to what we do, I wouldn't be here in college athletics. And so, I really encourage, I want our staff and our employees and the people we work with, I want our culture to be one where people love to show up to work. I believe college athletics is while wins and losses were measured by those things. There's another level of what drives me, and that is significance that I can provide back to people. And so when I got this job, and I shared this with our staff, and it sits on, I've got it sitting here on my desk. But I remember when I got this job, and I had been here 6 years with Ren, and so people knew me. They knew me as the chief operating officer. But when you move into the role, it's not like you're having to learn the people; they already know you.
Yeah.
I was at home on the elliptical, and I was listening to a John Maxwell podcast, and he said a quote that really resonated. It kind of, I was having a hard time thinking through how would I frame why we do what we do in college athletics. And
Yeah.
he said this quote. He said, "Success happens to you, significance happens through you.
Mm.
Once you taste significance, success will never satisfy." And
Wow.
so I think about just the competitive environment we are. We want success. Like,
Yeah.
it's great to have success, but I also believe that's a byproduct if you are providing significance back to the people you serve. And that's me as a leader serving, the people that I have direct touch points with. That's any of our staff with the significance they can provide to the coaches they serve, the student athletes they serve, for our external team. If we're providing significance back to alumni and the people who are invested in our programs, like if that's the core of what we do and we do it well, then the success piece is a byproduct of that. And then I also, there's a lot of things they say in coaching and athletics. There's two kinds of people: either those who have been fired or those who will be. That's kind of how you're measured with wins and
Yeah.
losses. But at the end of the day, I can sleep at night if I know, listen, we may have missed the mark for whatever reason on the success metrics and the success side of the equation. But I have yet to find when cultures, and this is true in sports, and it's also true in just the corporate world, when you have cultures that are focused on people and love people well and give people a chance to exercise their gifts and talents and bring that out, and that's what drives you every day, you're always going to find some level of success on the other end, because people are fulfilled and it drives them to do better, and they want to make an impact. And so every day I don't take for granted the opportunity we have with 340-ish student athletes to put an experience in front of them that is, we want them to have a championship level experience, but at the end of the day, we want them to be well-rounded young men and women who are prepared for life when they get done competing in sports. And so, that's really what drives me every day. And I think when I think about all the roles I've had, like, that's probably the one thing that, as I've gotten older, I probably lean into more than anything. If I feel things aren't right, I know I, as a leader, probably need to go back and focus more on serving people, significance. And like when I can get that, that's my North Star. I can generally navigate the tough, challenging times, and you're able to get through those because you've got people that are bought into the same vision, same goal, and it makes it a fun place to work. College athletics is hard. I think the time period we're in right now, with as much changing around us, you may not like it, you may not agree with it, but at the end of the day, we still have an awesome opportunity to utilize this vehicle of sports to provide ultimate life change for young men and women. So that excites me every day I'm here.
I love it. Well, Jared, I want to say thanks so much for sharing your journey and hopping on, and just excited to follow you and your journey ahead. And who knows, 3-4 years we'll probably have to do this again, and update on how everything's been going.
No, I appreciate the opportunity and certainly appreciate your podcast. I love. I think we've got so much to learn just from people and their stories, and it's really it has been fun to follow you and the guests you've had. So appreciate you having me today.